Yo, what's going on, YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte, and today we are taking a look at the Pittsburgh Penguins as their season is now basically officially a week ended now. It's officially the offseason for the Penguins, and for the second consecutive season, for the first time in the Sidney Crosby era in Pittsburgh, the Penguins have had back-to-back seasons of missing the Stanley Cup playoffs. We're going to take a look at what the Penguins can do to maybe address some of their issues, some of their depth issues. We're going to take a look at what they can maybe look to do this offseason, some of the moves we're expecting them to make, some guys that may be leaving that have already played their last game in Pittsburgh. Some of them we already know, some of them we don't know. We're going to kind of speculate, but we're going to go through all of that today. So I watched the Kyle Dubas press conference at the end of the season, so there's a couple things we already know. The first thing, it kind of looks like at this point, Tristan Jarry will be back for the Penguins. So let's start in between the pipes. Tristan Jarry will be back. There's still a little bit of controversy around who could be with Tristan Jarry in the tandem. And, Kyle Dubas kind of said it's probably going to be Joel Blomqvist, who is the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton Penguins goalie right now. So if you want something to watch, probably watching the baby pens is a good idea because that's going to give you an idea. If he plays really well during the playoffs this year in the Calder Cup for Wilkes-Barre, he might find himself a roster spot in the NHL next season, and that might mean the end for Alex Nedeljkovic. Now, what's really sad about that is he had a really good end to the season. He played really well for the Penguins, and I actually saw him in his game against the Islanders, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, wait, is that... Because I didn't watch before, right? I was kind of just watching the warm-ups, and I'm watching him across the ice because the Penguins warm up on the other side of where I sit, and I'm like, that guy is really small, and that's always been one of the knocks against Alex Nedeljkovic, right? Or I think it's Nedeljkovic, right? He's just not a big goaltender, and that's always been something that's gone against him. That really sucks. I hate that narrative out there, but the reality is, if you could have a Big Ben Bishop who barely moves, but he's 6'9", well, who cares if he can move that much? Because if he just stands in place, the puck's not going to be getting through him all that often, and I think that's just something that Ned kind of has always had to deal with in his career, and I hope he gets a spot in the NHL. If it's not with the Penguins, he'll find a job somewhere, because he played really well down the stretch, but that kind of seems like that's the debate right now. If Blomqvist really takes over in the AHL playoffs, that might be our guy next season, but we'll see what happens there. And the reality is, can they work out a deal with Nedeljkovic? That's going to be the other part of this that we also need to consider. So that's in between the pipes. Now let's also go behind the bench. I think that's another place a lot of Penguins fans at the end of the season were wondering in terms of, were we going to see Mike Sullivan, really an incredible coach for the Pittsburgh Penguins? Was he finally going to get the axe? And really there wasn't much talk about that from Kyle Dubas. He makes it sound like he's very involved with the process, and it kind of sounds like that's a guy Dubas is not ready to let go of yet. I see this as sort of a situation with the Devils were last year, which is kind of a bad spot, to be honest. He might start the season kind of on the hot seat, and if the Penguins come out of the gate, and let's say we get to November and the Penguins don't have a winning record, don't be surprised if they give him the axe. But the problem with that is, well, now you've given up the opportunity during the summer to maybe get a better candidate, and now that means the Penguins might be going for somebody internal. Maybe they go to the Scranton Penguins, right, and they decide to go down that route. But the problem is, if you wait that long, that means guys that are available right now or during the summer are no longer available, and your pool of options in November isn't the same as it would be in, say, July or June. And that's something the Penguins might have to live with, but I think Dubas is willing to die on that sword that he wants to keep Mike Sullivan. So there's also the other factors. You still have some of the core players that have really, they've been a part of the Mike Sullivan era, right? Letang, Malkin, Crosby, all those guys, they've been there with Sullivan, and I think they'd want out if Sullivan wasn't there anymore. I think that's going to be a swift sweep, where if Sullivan goes, don't be surprised if the rest of that core ends up leaving not too soon after, because it just seems like that kind of situation now in Pittsburgh. So we'll see what happens with that. So keep an eye on that, but it looks like Sullivan's job, at least to this point, seems to be pretty safe. Now, looking at some trade candidates, there's a lot of different directions you could go with this for the Penguins, because the Penguins, and this is where I want to look at the Penguins season, because a lot of the guys on the Penguins, They brought in a couple guys. One in particular, I was really, as an Islander fan, kind of like, oh shit, that guy might be really good for the Penguins, and it didn't really work. And two guys in particular, especially up front. And let's just get to it, because this is something that's really important for the Penguins season this year, and a huge reason why they kind of struggled. So let's start off with Riley Smith right here. Riley Smith is a guy you were really hoping to see better numbers from. He had 13 goals this season, 40 points, which, in a reduced role with the Penguins isn't terrible, but you really expected to see more from him. And you consider over his career, this is a guy that has much higher expectations of, right? You look at last season, he had almost a 60-point season, and I think that Penguins fans were hoping for at least 50 points from him this year. And you were thinking if he was going to be playing with Crosby and Malkin in the top six, he might see closer to that 60-point range like we saw last year. But, in all honesty, you look at the last couple of years, yeah, he hasn't been healthy and hasn't played a full 80-game schedule, but he's been racking up, 60 to 70, 50 to 60 points a season, barring a full 82 game schedule, these numbers would be a little bit higher, right? So the last time he's only had 13 goals, look at that. That's the last time we saw that. Even in a reduced season, he's had a lot more production. 13 goals. The last time he did that was the 2014-15 season. We're seeing similar numbers from him, literally the exact same numbers, 40 points, almost a decade ago. So, not a great season for Riley Smith. He's a guy I would expect to be on the trade block for the Pittsburgh Penguins. It's one of those things where it just didn't work out, but the problem is now you're trading him for less value than what you traded for him last year, and I don't know if Kyle Dubas is going to do that. It's going to be one of those things where somebody believes in him still, and they're like, listen, he had a bad season last year, we'll give up a first or second round. Well, let's say they get a second round pick for this guy. They get a second round pick for him, and they're able to flip it for another forward of a similar caliber or maybe of higher expectation, and then that's something Dubas could do. But like I said, I don't know if that's necessarily going to be on the table for the Penguins. And the other guy that we need to look at is a guy I find really, is near and dear to me as a Ducks fan. I really liked Rickard Rakell. And again, another guy you were hoping to see a little bit more production from. He only had 37 points this season. Again, it's not a great season by any regards for Rakell, but it's not one of the worst seasons either. You just were hoping for more for Rakell, and it just hasn't really panned out in his entire career in Pittsburgh. You look at 3 seasons now in Pittsburgh. He had 13 points in 19 games. He was injured during that season. He did have 60 points last year, which was pretty solid. But again, the expectations were a little bit higher for him coming in, that he could be almost a point-per-game player, or at least a 70-point player, right? And, the drop-off from last season to this season, yes, he did play 12 less games, but is that a 23-point drop in just 12 games? That's not good enough. That's something that the Penguins are going to look at and say, this is a guy we could probably look at showing the door and maybe finding greener pastures for both the team and for the player. And that could be on the table for Rickard Rakell this offseason. And for the Penguins defense, I think that's another thing we need to explore after what was a kind of tumultuous season for that blue line. They were not good, and it's a pretty glaring stat for the Penguins. Their goals against, it wasn't even that bad. It was basically the middle of the pack for the NHL. It was 15th in the National Hockey League, which isn't bad. But again, if you're talking about making the Stanley Cup playoffs and being a cup contender, you need to see better from that. And yeah, some of that is on the goaltending. The goaltending had its issues this season, but to put all the credit on the goaltending for that, to put all the blame on that for the goaltending isn't fair either. You got to hold some accountability for the defense. And let's find out on Hockey DB, because I think that's a really good way to kind of show this, because the defense wasn't there. And if you look at the lineup, yes, at the end of the season, they did not play their fully healthy defense because a lot of their guys did get hurt down the stretch. And that's a huge reason why their defense was not that good this year. But that's where you need your depth to come in, and they really didn't do that. And let's take a look at the lines here, because now again, this is on the last night of this season, so take this with a grain of salt. But here's your blue line for the Penguins to end the year, right? So you had P.O. Joseph and Letang on the top pair, Marcus Pettersson, Erik Karlsson, Ryan Shea, and Jack St. Ivany. So of these guys, P.O. Joseph, he's an NHL caliber defenseman. Letang, he's an NHL caliber defenseman, but his numbers are declining, and I don't think he's a top pairing defenseman anymore. Erik Karlsson, I think he's perfectly slotted on the second pair at this point. He's a good defenseman. I wouldn't say he's a top pairing defenseman. So that's kind of one of the things with Letang and Karlsson where they just, it's one of those things where one of those guys has to play on the top pair because you need the more defensive-minded guy to play alongside Karlsson and Letang, and that's what you get with P.O. Joseph and Pettersson. And again, you're kind of in a bind with those guys right now. And then Ryan Shea and Jack St. Ivany, and that's just not going to cut it. Neither of those guys is NHL caliber defenseman, in my opinion. I saw them play against the Islanders, and they were not good. In person, they did not look good. And even the games I watched of the Penguins down the stretch, that game against the Predators was a very glaring, this team has defensive issues. They need another caliber defenseman. And I will say, here is the caveat for the Penguins' blue line. They did have some injuries there, right? John Ludwig, Ryan Graves. But to be honest with you, if you're relying on Ryan Graves and John Ludwig to be your excuses for not having good defense, that's not going to cut it for me. Ryan Graves, maybe. He's a third pairing defenseman. John Ludwig, similar category. He's a seventh defenseman, maybe a sixth, as kind of a healthy scratch, jumps into the lineup for maybe 20 games. The reality is those guys aren't good enough. So then comes, well, what do you do? Who do you bring in? And for the Penguins, typically this is where I would say this is the kind of the Jack Johnson player. Now, I'm going to say do not bring back Jack Johnson because you could get someone a lot better than that. But this is where you're looking for maybe that more of a shutdown defenseman. And being an Islanders fan, I will say I'm thinking of like a Scott Mayfield type defenseman, right? I think Ryan Graves has tried to fill that role for the Penguins, but he's just not there. I think you're looking for a guy that is a shutdown defenseman that can drop the gloves, can give the sandpaper, can give it to the other team, give the stinky glove in front of the net after the whistle. You need that kind of guy, and I think the Penguins need to go down that road. And depending on who's available this summer, that could be that type of player. I think looking back in the past for the Penguins, this isn't a guy I would bring in, but another comparison of like a Robert Bortuzzo, right? You're looking at that type of defenseman if I'm the Penguins. Like I said, you're not bringing back those players. Do not bring back Jack Johnson or Robert Bortuzzo, or don't trade for Scott Mayfield. Believe me, he's not worth the contract as an Islander fan, but that type of defenseman, okay? So that's my thoughts there. Going back up front, I think the Penguins really missed out. I think it was 2 years ago when the Rangers went out and signed Vincent Trocheck. The Penguins were one of the other teams that was in the running, but they decided to not go down that path. And considering Vinny Trocheck is from Pittsburgh, PA, that would have been a perfect opportunity for them to go out and acquire him. And I think this is a situation where the Penguins could have really used a guy like that in their lineup on the third line. Now, he might have even jumped to the second line, depending on how things went. But I think you need a guy like that to fill out your lineup. And a guy I would look at, again, here I am saying another Islanders reference, but I think to fill out that third line, the Islanders might be looking to move on from Jean-Gabriel Pageau, and I think Pageau would be a great addition there in Pittsburgh. Now, like I said, as an Islander fan, I don't want to see the Islanders trade him to Pittsburgh, but again, that's the type of guy you're looking for. He's accountable defensively. What that would do also is move Lars Eller down to the fourth line as a center. I think that's a good thing. You move Nola Chari to the wing, and now you've got a legitimate, competent third-line center, and that's really what you're looking for there. As much as I like guys like Drew O'Connor and Puustinen and Ponomarev, those guys are not ready for that type of role. You got to find a legitimate, bona fide NHL player to fill that void. And now that Jeff Carter is going to be leaving the team, he's retiring, well, now you have an opportunity to maybe put someone in there. And that's the other guy I want to mention. Jeff Carter has announced his retirement. Like I said, I was at that game. Really good job there by the Islanders, giving him the the standing ovation at the end of the game, and it was a really nice thing that the Penguins did. Shout out to the Penguins franchise for that too, because those guys let him and his family walk down the tunnel at the end of the game, and everybody followed after. Really class act there by the Penguins, and that's why guys go to Pittsburgh, because they see things like that. And really nice a testament to detail there by the Penguins doing that. So shout out to them for that. So anyway, the next thing I want to look at, okay? Let's say, right, because I kind of mentioned, the Penguins really need a top pairing defenseman. And this is where maybe you start to look at the depth in the Penguins, the prospect pool for the Penguins, because now the Penguins are at the point now where you want to start looking at some of your younger players and just getting a feel. Are these guys capable of playing in the NHL? And I mentioned goaltending earlier with Joel Blomqvist, but is there any other players, either a forward or a defenseman, that can jump into that sort of role? And I was kind of looking around the Penguins' depth chart and their blue line prospects, and there were a couple names that kind of interested me, right? So obviously the first one that's an easy one is Owen Pickering. Owen Pickering is 20 years old, 6'4", 180-pound, 2022 first-round pick of the Pittsburgh Penguins. He's a left-shot defenseman, and what I really like about Owen Pickering is the fact he is a left-shot defenseman. Now, the past 2 seasons, he spent with the Swift Current Broncos, and he's done pretty well there. 45 points in 60 games last season, and he had similar numbers this year. 46 points in 59 games, but his plus-minus was a lot better. So is that because he's more defensively accountable, or is that because just overall maybe the team around him is playing better? And hopefully this doesn't get flagged on YouTube for having those ads. But anyway, so here we go. So yeah, looking at his numbers, pretty solid. And like I said, the plus-minus is the thing I'm looking at the most. Like I said, plus 18 this season compared to a minus 5 last year. And look at those numbers in Swift Current. They were pretty horrid. And the thing is, looking at his numbers in Wilkes-Barre last year, he was not good last year with the Scranton Penguins. Again, he only played 8 games with the team. He was a minus 9. There's a reason he got sent back to Swift Current. But I will say, this is a guy that has potential. And maybe not next season. Maybe the second half of next season. Let's say the Penguins are out of it. They're out of a play. Oh, hell, even if they are in a playoff spot, let's say that they're looking for some help on the blue line. He should be one of the first call-ups from Wilkes-Barre Scranton next season as a left-shot defenseman to play alongside maybe Carlson or Letang. And yes, I'm saying go out on a limb. Don't throw this guy on the third pair. Don't throw him with a Ryan Graves or a St. Ivani or a Ludwig. Put him with your top players. That is where I think he is most... I think that's where he's going to perform his best. Now, is that necessarily the best pairing for him, considering he is more of an offensive-minded defenseman and playing alongside Letang and Carlson, who also jump up on the play? Well, now that puts a lot more pressure on Pickering, which isn't ideal, but this is a kid I think that can handle that. I think this is the type of player you want to throw to the Wolves, see if he can handle it, and maybe that could backfire on you, and maybe it doesn't work out, but that's something... If this is going to be a player that you want to play in the top 4 as a defenseman, put him in that role, because that is where he is going to play over the duration of his career. Let him develop there. That's my opinion on that. I'd love to know what you guys think. Would you like to see Owen Pickering start for the Penguins next season? Or again, he is 20 years old. He is a defenseman. Maybe let him develop a little more. Hopefully he puts on a little size over this summer. He's only 180 pounds at 6'4". That's a peanut. He's got to get a little bit bigger, maybe closer to that 190 range at least, right? We know these smaller defensemen can make it. Looking at great examples, Quinn Hughes, Luke Hughes, really good examples of that. The smaller defensemen, but they're very mobile. And I think the Penguins could really use that on their blue line next season. So instead of maybe going out and acquiring a top 4 defenseman from somewhere, maybe that answer is within, and it's a guy like Pickering. Because now you go out, let's say they trade for a left shot defenseman in the top 4. Well, now that's a spot that's taking away from the development of Pickering. And is that something that the Penguins want to do? Again, these are the questions we need to ask ourselves. Or maybe it's something where they trade Ricard, Raquel, or a guy like Riley Smith for that defenseman. But are those players worth that value? I don't know if that's necessarily going to happen. So a lot of questions, a lot of things that hopefully will get answered over the summer for the Penguins. Like I said, it was a rough season for Penguins and the Penguins fans. I get it. I'd love to go to Pittsburgh one time at least before Malkin and Crosby and Letang retire. I have not been able to make the voyage there. Maybe this winter I will make that trip there. If you guys have any recommendations for anything in Pittsburgh, any places I need to visit, any places I need to go, let me know in the comment section down below. And like I said, I'd love to know your guys' thoughts. Let's play Armchair GM for the Penguins. If you were Kyle Dubas, what changes would you make to this roster? I'd love to know what you guys think. Also, we've got our merch for the summer. It is officially out, so check out our Goal Line Hockey team shop. There should be a couple of links in the description down below. We've got hats, we've got t-shirts, we've got mugs, we've got beanies, we've got sweaters, we've got all that stuff available. And I'm also going to be dropping some tank tops for the summer here over the next couple weeks, so make sure to stay tuned for that. Also, if you'd like to become a member and donate to the channel, give a little support, we have 3 different tiers to that, the silver, bronze, and gold. So if you're interested in joining that as well, I definitely would appreciate that. Guys, as always, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you again next time. Peace out, guys.